All right, ladies, gentlemen, and everything in between, we are the sarcastic, bombastic, slightly made of plastic and elastic podcast, all about gaming. We are D Infinity Live, and tonight we have a very, very packed show on the subject of research in your tabletop campaign. And this week, we want to welcome back the amazing and triumphant return of Michael Jolly of Arhola.
Welcome back.
There, Mike. And also the return of Brendan Cass. And two very special guests. With me right here is Jason Michael Aarons, one of the other thirds of Kettlefish Productions, and also from the Hobby Shop Dungeon, Benoit Poiret.
Hello.
Hey.
All right, guys, glad to have you on the show. But before we get into our main topic, we've actually got a lot of pretty cool updates for you. Mike, first off, what is going on with our co-publisher Skirmisher this week?
Well, we have had a busy season between me and Brendan being overseas for a month, and that coming hard on the heels of our convention season. It's been a while since we've had a new release out, and finally today we came out with a new publication. It is Wisdom from the Wastelands, issue number 42, Super Science Artifacts 2. So this is an issue that's based on Arthur C. Clarke's premise that anything that is sufficiently technologically advanced will present as magic to people who can't understand the technology. So it's a series of pretty neat and kind of weird artifacts that people can use in any kind of science fiction or futuristic or post-apocalyptic game. And it's all statted for basic system, mutant future, could get dropped into a Labyrinth Lord or basic D&D game. So I would encourage people to check that out, Wisdom from the Wastelands, issue 42. And we're back into a mode whereby I'm going to promise that I'm going to try to roll out one new publication a week again. Remember I was promising that back in January?
Yeah, we remember.
Yeah, we remember. So we're going to try that again. But we're back in a production mode. So check that out on DriveThruRPG and other fine online retailers, and look for more to come from us.
Very cool. And Brendan, what has been going on our website, d-infinity.net?
Well, many things, as usual. Chris Van Deelen has gone absolutely crazy with his conversions from the Aliens and Predator franchise. So if you're a fan of that series, he's got everything from every single kind of monster that ever appeared in there, or alien that appeared in there, and he's even in weapons now. So if you're running a sci-fi game of any variety, he's got pretty much every weapon that shows up for 10 seconds to however long in that entire franchise. So that's pretty neat.
Yeah, I saw that sidearm posted earlier today.
Yeah. So he does a really good job about it. He's pretty passionate about it. I think that might be his favorite franchise. So,
I think so.
Definitely worth checking out. And then Mike, not too long ago, wrote an article about travel-inspired spells. Right now, it's an article about the inspiration and the concept of the spell, and I know he's planning on fleshing those out to actually have some game crunch so you can use those in your games as well, which is appropriate for the month of travel that we were doing, and also for today's subject. So all very cool.
Well, all those spells we talked about were actually directly inspired by things that happened on that month-long trip through the Aegean.
Exactly.
So
yeah. And then finally, Clint Staples pulled together an article on texts and tomes that you might be able to just drop right into your games. He's got a pretty substantial list in there, really easy to read through and find something that sounds interesting, just drop it right in. So all cool stuff. As usual, you're always going to be able to find neat things on dinfinity.net.
Yeah, and actually the tomes were a lot of fun brainstorming going on between me and Clint there.
Yeah.
My own personal favorite being the book of the feet of things I've killed, which is a guide to identifying prey written by an orc who killed things and then stamped their feet into the book.
That's awesome. Excellent idea.
Oh yeah, got a lot of good stuff with that. Now, I think it's about time, though, Brendan and Mike, the two of you accounted for your absence these past months.
Well, yeah, that's right. We have been gone for a while, and since Mike spent more time in Greece, and since that's where a lot of our stuff takes place, I'll let Mike start. But I also went to some cool places that he didn't get to go to, that I'll talk about briefly.
Yeah, well, my wife and I, at certain times, various friends, spent a month in Greece, and we went over there with a number of things in mind. Part of it was vacation, but I never really vacation. Everything is a working thing for me, research and whatnot. So the short version is, we flew into Athens and then moved on to the islands of Crete, Santorini, Rhodes, Kos, Nasiros, and then back to Athens. And during that time, we did everything from hike through gorges to climb up to the top of smoking volcanic craters, to go to walled medieval cities. And this was all ties in with what we're talking about tonight, research, and so we can go into specifics later. But basically, we spent a month just doing things that tied in with the game projects that we've got in the works. Things that tie in with the Swords of Kos fantasy campaign setting. Well, we actually went to Kos and spent time exploring the very places that we have in our Swords of Kos novels and the Swords of Kos fantasy campaign setting. We've got a great adventure set on the island of Nasiros, so we went to Nasiros and we saw what the volcano really looks like there. We talk about the wonders of the ancient world, so we went to a spot where one of the wonders of the ancient world was located. So basically, it was just a month of traveling around and looking at what these things really look like. We talked about the explosion of the Thera volcano, so we went to Thera, we went to Santorini, and actually visited the ruined city of Akrotiri, which was a Minoan city 3,700 years ago that was covered in ash when that went off, when the volcano went off. So it was a month of research for our fantasy campaign setting, for an article I'm doing for Gygax magazine, and for any number of other projects. We'll be deriving material from the things we did and experienced and saw for a long time to come.
That's cool.
Very cool. And you guys have a chance to check out the Dream Temple of Hippocrates?
Well, we did get to go to a Dream Temple of Hippocrates, not necessarily the Dream Temple of Hippocrates. But yeah, it was cool. The Dream Temples of Hippocrates are built into the ground so that you're closer to the earth, so that the spirit of the earth will guide your dreams, and then you have your dreams and you tell that to your physician, and that helps them diagnose you. So that was something that not only did actually happen, but is something that people even know about today, and have built things that resemble that today. And what makes things like that interesting, and the reason why Mike and I are so into going places to actually research these places, is not to make us dry or overly technical when we're doing this stuff. It's to help inspire the storytelling, right? Because you can cast a cure disease spell, right? Just a regular cure disease spell.
Well, I prepared it this morning.
Right. When you cast your cure disease spell, it could take the form of one of these dreams, right? Absolutely. So that it's just a little bit more special, a little bit more clever, and it's not that creative people can't come up with this stuff on their own, but it's that human beings that have been around for thousands of years have tried to explain certain phenomena for a really long time, and they used mysticism, and they used magic, and they used some of this other stuff to explain it already. And they've already come up with it and used it in their real life. So, I mean, it goes even beyond gaming. They actually used it. So, for example, Budapest, which I spent a good amount of time in while I was in Europe, it was settled on the site of what they refer to as healing springs. And these healing springs are the reason why they stayed there. It's also on a good spot on the Danube, so that's a major river. But they're mineral springs, right? But they believe that they had healing qualities, right? So you include that in a fantasy campaign, for example. There's no reason why your healing springs wouldn't be able to do something to the effect of casting Cure Minor Wounds or something like that on you when you take a dip. And that would definitely be a reason why people would settle that. So it inspires a lot of things that we can use as a springboard for creative work later, which is a big motivator for me to travel around and look at things through the eyes of a gamer and so on.
Well, when we visited the site you were talking about, Brendan, on Kos, the
Yes.
Hippocrates Village, I mean, something that I've never gotten an allusion to in anything I've read, but was really clear in the imagery and everything we learned there, is that, I mean, they virtually said an ancient physician would have a snake as a familiar. I mean, they virtually said that.
Yeah,
and
it was
that's
almost black letter. Yeah.
that's almost a gameism. But you really saw how a snake was perceived as like an assistant to a physician in the 5th century BC in Greece. So us actually going to a reconstructed 5th century BC Greek villa and herbal garden and seeing the herbs that a physician would have had and seeing his little bowl of snake skin and the kind of house he would have lived in. I mean, this is something that there is no substitute for. To actually being boots on the ground. And it bears mentioning that I was in Greece for a month. Brendan flew into Kos and was there a day and a half with me. So we spent a day and a half adventuring there, and some of it really was an adventure.
Yeah, it was an adventure.
And then the rest of the time, Brendan was in Hungary and Italy while I was in Greece.
Yeah, so I spent more time in Hungary, which is a wonderful place, and definitely still has some of that kind of medieval charm sticking to it. So if you're less inclined towards the classical Greek, which I don't know why you wouldn't be, but if you're more into that sort of European feeling kind of history, then Budapest and Eastern Europe still has a lot of that clinging to it, and it's nice it's pretty cool to see that in person. And then when I was in Italy, I ended up stopping by Pompeii and Herculaneum for the purpose of seeing what has to be the most intact and the closest thing to what you would see of one of these ancient towns, still standing.
Yes.
And some of the stuff that they came up with is not necessarily things that you necessarily pay attention to until you look at it. I was in a bathhouse or a ruined bathhouse in Pompeii. They've got a floor, right, and they've got pillars which hold up the floor, and there's a gap, and they would run furnaces so that the heated air would travel underneath the top layer, and that would heat the water. So that's how they had their heated water, which was, very clever, a simple solution that got the job done. And, you don't really notice stuff like that. You just figure, well, they have water, and it's a bath, and it's warm, and it gets warm somehow. But the mechanics of that actually resonate with me because, everyone's you might be on the fence if you're trying to do a sort of medieval fantasy kind of campaign, wondering, how advanced would these people actually be? Well, it's a really clever solution. So they're probably just as clever as you are, if not more so, because these guys design baths for a living. So the answer is pretty damn advanced. And then you start throwing magic into the mix, and then all kinds of things happen.
So instead of a furnace, they might have a dragon underneath that first floor.
Just so, yeah.
Well,
or a fire salamander.
Honestly, what they would have if they could control elemental forces is molten rock, because all of these are volcanic islands that we were on. Pompeii was destroyed. It's not on an island; it's on the mainland, but it was destroyed by volcanic forces. Yep. So really, that's what you would see. Probably not something as blatant as jamming a dragon down there, but more just the idea that people would be controlling the flow of magma and trying to channel it, and use it for things like that. So elemental magic, but probably less
the
practical way.
Oracle of Delphi. Supposedly they put that temple there because the cracks in the earth, the mineral waters would actually create fumes that would come up through there and give her prophetic visions, because truly they're basically driving the person insane and giving them visions and hallucinations.
Yeah.
So picking the right places along the coast really does influence a culture.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely.
And
It's useful to see those kind of things for real, like you are talking about the system to warm up the water. When you're building a dungeon especially, that is very useful to see those kind of things, because after you think about the environment and the mapping of that place in a completely different way. You're starting to think about the third dimension and how the pipes go through the levels of the dungeons, and how does the water get there? What does it get after? And how is it used by the people who build this dungeon to actually be useful? Where are the latrines? And so on and so forth, you know. And that adds these little details, which for the players when they play, will get drawn into the game and believe it's a place that's alive.
It's true, and you said it just right, Ben. It feels alive, and I think that's the sort of thing that really resonates with players. That's the sort of thing that they end up finding really cool. It really rounds out your dungeon and so on.
It doesn't need to be correct in the sense that it's like impressionism, in painting. Like a little dash of little details like this are way enough to create that illusion that it is real.
Yeah, and that's something that I think is really important with research is you don't want your research to stop you from doing something amazing in your campaign or in your setting or whatnot. The research should enhance what you're doing, should expand what you're doing. It should never stop. If you're doing your research and you realize, we can't really have giant dire boars here because boars weren't indigenous to this environment. But if a giant boar is really cool, then you put that giant boar in. You can justify it later.
Exactly.
I agree with you, Will. I mean, one of the stories I did that's set on Coast is called Eumaeus and the Skunks. And it starts off with our hero, Eumaeus, watching two skunks sort of tussling with each other. And if you do any kind of research into real-world dispersal of species, you'll realize skunks don't live in the Mediterranean. There aren't actually any skunks in the Mediterranean. So I've sort of conflated what I've seen with skunks here in Texas with what my character's doing in the Mediterranean.
Mm-hmm.
But, we did throw dragons into an environment without people bitching about it. You can throw skunks into an environment without people bitching about it. So I figure if dragons are fair play, if orcs are fair play, skunks are fair play. But you're right. You want to let the story. Your research needs to open doors for you, and only close ones that really, really, really need to be closed.
We were doing that with Ernest when we started really building the setting around the dungeon, and we drew from a variety of sources, and we wanted to blend them all together, right? So, for instance, we would look at Charlemagne and the matter of France and the matter of Britain, Arthur. We would look at Paul Anderson, and we would look at the Crusades, right? And at the end, we ended up blending the Great Lakes area of the United States with the Mediterranean. And if you look at the map of the whole area, you could recognize a France that has been flipped over and put to the west. And the area of the dungeon would be kind of like the Holy Land of the Crusades. But we switched that for a crusade against the giants. Right, and from there, that's how the duchy that was there before grew. Right, we blended different things together, mashed them together, instead of trying to be faithful to one particular source. We created something that we thought was unique, and very much an homage to the sources that Gary Gygax was using when he created Greyhawk. Right, but something that's unique, and that's exactly that. You want the sources to be useful to what to create, and not stop you on the minute detail of realism. You want to create the illusion of realism, not realism itself.
That's right. That's right.
All right, we've got our first question from a viewer this evening. This comes once again from friend of the show, Heath, who has a two-pronged question. That being, what is your ideal balance of research, both in-game and out? Let's see, and then out of game, when do you or a player want to research something, and has it ever gotten out of hand? I'm going to start with the second prong only because for a lot of people, research can become a trap. Not just in terms of when people's research makes them think they have to close doors, like Mike was talking about, but when they just get trapped forever in this endless cycle of research because they learn one fact, which makes them look over here, and then they learn something there that makes them look over here. And we all have that friend who's been working on one novel for 10 or more years, and they don't have any of it written because they're always doing the research. So you don't want the research to get in the way of actually writing down or planning or playing the campaign. You've got to be able to kind of train yourself to get just enough information and still get everything down on paper that you need.
I've actually gotten into a fight with a player over a fact because we disagreed on a historical fact about Savannah, the city that the game was set in. And he said, well, that didn't happen. Well, that's a recorded history that you might know. But in my game, because I'm the ST, I've decided that there's a twist to the history. Now, I do know the stuff that came before it, and I can add that little bit of research that I've done. But when a player tries to say, well, then you've missed this whole thing. Well, I'm saying that the story that's happening right now and the fact that it's given to your character, he might not know any of that history that you personally know, and you're metagaming. But that I've lost. Right. What was I trying to say?
About
I'm the ST. Listen to me.
Well, I used to game with a bunch of scientists and engineers. Actually, I still do. They're all very smart people, and I think Mike's favorite line typically during a game is, "Well, your character's not a mathematician." But in this case, I am playing with a bunch of mathematicians, and a lot of times, if there's something physics-based in an encounter, they'll actually start cranking out formula. And you know what? If they can get through that formula quick enough, I'll figure out some way to incorporate it. But yeah, it can be real cumbersome. But to answer the first part of Heath's question, how much research will I do? Typically, when I'm preparing for a session, I will, try to incorporate as much stuff that is relevant as I can, conceivably remember. Everything, typically, if I've included it as a significant portion of my scenario, it's inspired by something that I've researched, for sure. I like to validate all the things that I come up with by researching something that has happened somewhere before and works well in this particular situation.
Well, and and a good example of that, Brendan, is the things we learned that came out of the research based on some of the things we did while we were on coast. At one point, for example, we rented an ATV and we drove way up into the hills, up onto the slopes of Mount Dikaios, and we were up in this pine forest. It's funny. You get an image of what the Mediterranean is, and down by the sea coast and coast, you've got palm trees, and it's very, very tropical.
Yep.
But even if we'd read that up in the mountainous areas it's alpine, there are Calabrian pine trees, it wouldn't have sunk in quite the way it did with us going up into this pine forest on this mountain. That really struck us, how temperate an alpine it was. And then we actually scaled a mountain. We scaled a mountain up to the top of a ruined fortress. And I mean, this is just amazing. This is a fortress where, according to all canonical mythological sources, Hercules landed on the island of Kos. He was separated from his companions. He had to flee and exfiltrate the area he was in dressed as a woman and he climbed up the same mountain we climbed up, and he hid in this castle for a period of time while he was rallying his forces and getting ready to lead a war against the king of Kos. And he defeated the king of Kos, and he married his daughter, and their child, their son, became the king of the island of Nasiros that we mentioned at the beginning of the show. So these are things we didn't actually know when we started the Swords of Coast fantasy campaign setting. When we started developing the setting 12 years ago, we didn't know any of that stuff. We really learned some of these things just because we were on the ground, and there's still a body of local lore about Hercules having taken refuge in that ancient village. And we learned all this because we went to that ancient village, and we climbed up to the top of that mountain, and we talked to people and read sources in the local area. I mean, that kind of stuff is indispensable. We never would have come up on our own the idea of having an adventure where the characters have to cross-dress to escape from their enemies and then hide in this little castle. Right. This came from the legend of Hercules as we learned it on the island of Kos.
Now, on the flip side of that, Mike, we were surprised at a number of things that we had made up that ended up being true. Like,
very
for example, I wrote a story about a transplanted Germanic man that had a farm that was burnt down, and he was sort of forced into being an adventurer. And the first encounter he had was with a pair of thuggish, effectively Russians. And so Mike and I land, and we're at the hotel, and we go to rent our four-wheeler, and
from thuggish Russians.
Thuggish Russians. Everywhere. There were actually a ton of them on Kos, and somehow I was prophetic in deciding that was going to be the ethnicity of burly, thuggish people on that island, and they are actually there. I had no way of knowing this, but they are actually there. And then Mike ended up making some decisions about a certain mountain.
Mount Dikaios. We have a cult of half-orcs, a half-orc cult running around on Mount Dikaios, and they worship Kronos, Zeus's father, the Titan of Time. If you read the old deities and demigods, it wasn't he called the Greater Titan of Time? Yes. And we find out, I mean, so they're running around Mount Dikaios, these orc cultists that worship the Titan of Time, and we discover while we're on Kos that Mount Dikaios used to be known as Mount Oromadon, which means Lord of Time. So this was just a chilling thing for us to realize that we had this cult who worshiped the Time Lord running around on this mountain, and that's actually, in antiquity, what the mountain was named for. So some very interesting things that just make you wonder, is there this psychic current that you're just tapping into inadvertently? There were just so many little things like that just kept cropping up. We picked an arbitrary spot for the Hippodrome, the stadium. What we picked turns out that it was just a couple of blocks from where the real stadium was in Kos. So just some very, very strange things. And Will, you're the one that picked the location for the stadium.
Yep.
Yeah, and lo and behold, I get on the ground, and I got to send you a scan of the map that I got there. It's just a couple blocks from where the stadium actually was. So funny stuff.
That's great. That's awesome. When that happens, that's really a good feeling, isn't it? Yeah.
All right, our next question comes from David Paul Lehman, who wants to know, I found the books by Alvin Toffler and the historians William Strauss and Neil Howe to be very inspirational when it comes to creating fantasy settings. Have you used these or other sources that define a structure of historical development? I'm going to say, regrettably, no. This is actually the first I've ever heard of those particular historians. Has anybody else heard of them?
I've heard of Toffler, yeah.
Well, the source I like to use, that's Gibbon. That's the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. That's a source I go back to whenever we're creating nations especially nations of the past, that have spread and had, like a rise like the Roman Empire and ultimate breakdown. It's very interesting to see his theory of the way, like the Pax Romana and Augustus, and the way that was basically broken down by the later emperors, and because the empire spread beyond the boundaries of the Pax Romana, basically that's what brought the empire ultimately. That's a very interesting source to read. It's that's the whole decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Yeah.
What about Plato's histories?
What about?
Oh, I'm just saying as an example, another example, because he kind of writes down the stories that he had heard of great civilizations that came before the Greeks and Romans, including, of course, the Epic of Atlantis.
Right.
Right.
And
That's right. Yeah.
That's good. Yeah, that's a good source too. Yeah.
Although, speaking of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, the first 3 foundation novels are just the rise and fall of the Roman Empire with the serial numbers filed off and spaceships
True.
added.
Yeah, very much so, yes.
Asimov was a hack. Yep.
In a lot of ways, it's a good idea to just take your research to the next level and just outright steal, because a lot of really great work can come out of that.
Well, in history, everything's already happened.
Oh, right. It's not really stealing.
Well, one thing that you guys were talking about earlier, I made a mental note of that. When you were having an argument with a player, and there's a tendency for people who imagine a certain historical scenario or a certain society to try to imagine it too smooth and too perfect. And there's that saying that says reality is always stranger than fiction. And that's actually true. Reality is a lot more granular and a lot more surprising than we imagine. So it's very hard to pin down some historical societies and say it was always like this, and people always hated this, or there always were exceptions, specific festivals in villages, myths and legends that were local that debunked or created an exception to the rule, and so on and so forth. So it's always good to look at the micro things like that and see them for real, so that you can feed on that.
And we haven't really explicitly mentioned that field work is a type of research, and we've got primary research and we've got secondary research. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of secondary research that I enjoy doing very much, and honestly, I think even just non-specific research is very, very helpful. If I'm doing something set on the island of Kos, reading about something that happened on Kos, sure, that's useful. But I think just reading history or natural history or mythology or ancient travel logs, this is something people don't necessarily know exist. I mean, in the 2nd century BC, there were Greek historians who were traveling around looking at the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and they were writing about them. So travel log and journals, these things all go back thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And I would say that reading any of this kind of stuff, just in general, is going to make your game a little better, just in general. I mean,
anything can become a source of inspiration. Anything. I think that one of a mark of a creator or an author or a game designer, you should be curious about pretty much anything you come in contact with, whether that's music, pictures, paintings, whatever. I remember one day I was walking my dogs and I saw a very interesting trap set by a spider. And that was, she had built a web horizontally, and between blades of grass there was a second web that was vertical, right? And it was to create a sort of trap, thinking that the fly would avoid the first web that was visible with the water and go into the second one.
Oh,
and I thought that's very clever, right?
Yeah.
And that inspired a trap I put later in my game.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing you see, you can get inspired by something completely out of the blue.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, like in the D20 system, which I love, we read that vermin, scorpions and spiders and whatnot, are non-intelligent. And, I deal with scorpions all the time. I'll come into a room, a scorpion will notice me, he'll take a couple steps back and put his pincers up. That's not a mark of non-intelligence. It might be a mark of an alien intelligence. It might be an inexplicable intelligence. But non-intelligence would imply that these things can't react to phenomena around them. And this simply is not the case. So I think you get some real limitations from game designers, from game masters, and you hear this once in a while, and you usually just ignore them and step away after they say something like, "Well, I don't really read anything. I just get it all from my imagination." Well, that's not worth anything.
That never comes out of
if they're not
nowhere.
imaginative enough to read a book, if they're not imaginative enough to go somewhere and see something and do something, then they're sure as hell not imaginative enough to actually make a good game or interesting scenario. This I can pretty much
the sort of books that I really, so there are a bunch of encyclopedias that are sort of targeted towards children that have a lot of not only illustrations, but they're also like vivisected illustrations where they'll like show you all the pieces of something as it comes together and stuff. I can't recommend those enough. Those sort of books, and usually they're a little bit pricey, but these days you can get this stuff online now. It's a lot cheaper. But yeah, if you keep an eye out for those encyclopedias that have like all these illustrations, usually they'll be called an illustrated history of such and such. And those are really, really useful for inspiring people.
I was one of the.
After that, anything that's been written by a German, you can't really go wrong with if you want just really detailed, dry, research. Mike and I found a very detailed book of architecture, classic architecture, from a guy called Wolfram Höpfner. So I mean,
we're trying to track down a copy of the darn thing.
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention that when we had the one-page dungeon contest not so long ago, and I was one of the judges with Ernest, and there's a guy who basically picked one of those side cuts of one of those insects that you were describing, Brennan, and the guy had actually built a dungeon in the entrails of the giant insect.
That's
so the
cool.
dungeon was the side cut of the insect, which was awesome. That was a very cool idea, I thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is very neat. And I got Brendan, I have to second your suggestion of looking for those like children's books. Some of those illustrations actually turn out to be very accurate, very detailed diagrams and maps and things, and those are so useful to have.
And children's books are not to be despised. If you don't know anything about a subject, you are a child as far as that subject's concerned. So getting a book that's intended for a third grader or a sixth grader and looking at the pictures and reading the simple text, I do this all the time as the first step in understanding a subject. I'll go to the library, I'll get a kid's book, I'll flip through it, and suddenly I know as much as a fourth grader is supposed to know about a particular subject. Well, if that's more than I knew to start with, then that's a good basis, and then I can move on to more complicated text to start, answering my questions about it.
Very cool. And our next question comes from Wayne Walls, who wants to know what books are considered indispensable for research for a fantasy campaign. I can't speak. I guess I can't speak too specifically for fantasy, other than to say I read when I want to get ideas for a fantasy campaign. I read Michael Moorcock, Fritz Lieber, or Robert E. Howard. But I can say, if you're looking to do something with the Cthulhu mythos and that kind of dark eldritch fantasy, two books you want to turn to. First, one, any big giant collection of H.P. Lovecraft stories. Absolutely go back to the primary source. And two, the Encyclopedia Cthulhiana. I don't know if you can see this on the webcam. There's actually a stain going down the middle of the book just from how many times I've flipped through it looking for references for things when I'm planning Cthulhu live events or mythos stories or Call of Cthulhu tabletop games. It's a very well-researched book. This particular edition is out of print. I think there's a new edition that came out last year under the title Cthulhu Mythos Encyclopedia, but a very, very good thing to have in the library.
Chaosium.
That is by Chaosium, yes.
But mine is this. That's the Dungeon Master's Guide. Advanced Dungeons and Dragons.
Again, you go back to the source material.
That's it. That if you want inspiration for a fantasy campaign, this is the best role-playing game book you can ever get. Even if you're not playing first edition, it is so chock full of ideas, random tables, little pieces of advice, including the Appendix N, which includes all the literature you just quoted, William, and that is the absolute best advice you can get, and just inspiration machine.
Isn't this a better version, Ben?
That's the later version with the easily cover. Yeah, that's the original. That's brilliant.
The old fart version, the showing my age version. I actually didn't spend $10.75 for this thing.
But that's a book that, if you're not playing first edition, you should have it anywhere in your library of role-playing games. You should check it out.
I agree, Ben. When we created Skirmisher's first book, Experts, and then its second book, Warriors, we drew heavily on that Dungeon Master Guide for the troop types, for the expert types, for the different professions we included. We basically took anything that got a one-word tribute in that book that you held up and extrapolated it into a chapter.
Yeah. Still today, it's a one-of-a-kind, this book. There's nothing that comes close to it.
All right, who's next? You go on next, Brendan, on indispensable books, or mine?
I mean, so the books that I always keep with me are Arabian Nights, because that is one of those collections of original stories that inspired so many other things.
One translation.
Any of them, really. The one that I tend to go to because it's easily accessible is the one on Project Gutenberg. But there are so many good ones, and you know, each one adds its own little bit of translator's bias, which is okay. So you look at a bunch of different ones, and so I always find that a good source. And I mean, the Grimm's fairy tales, those are always, you know, they inspired so many things. Holy books. If I'm trying to base a campaign that is inspired by a culture in a region, then I definitely pull things from the holy literature of that culture, because inevitably, whatever your feelings happen to be on religion, it doesn't matter if you don't like it, because people before you have liked it, and that has significantly influenced their culture. So the Quran, if you're doing something in the Middle East, the Bible, or you know, the you know, various Taoist texts as well, have been very useful for when I was basing things in the Far East. So. Yeah, those tend to be the things that I go to, just because that tends to be the jumping off point from which a lot of people are getting their information.
If I had to pick two books that I consider to be indispensable, and you know, and I know that we're living in a day and age where a lot of people just don't read, so we're sort of like just. How much do these words we're saying mean to anyone? I suspect a lot of people who are listening, it means something to them. But I'd say the two indispensable texts for me are the Odyssey, which is the story of the hero Odysseus returning home from the Trojan War and trying to go from the northeastern end of the Aegean all the way down through the southern end and all the way back up to the northwestern end of the Aegean, and how it takes him 10 years to do that. And this is really, debatably, the basis of every adventure story that has come afterwards, even the Arabian Nights to some extent. I would postulate that the adventures of Sinbad, some were directly inspired by the Odyssey. I'd say in general they were, because the Arabs who wrote the Arabian Nights, they'd read the Greek classics, so they knew the Odyssey, they knew the adventures of Odysseus. So I'd say the Odyssey, and then one that is a tough read. Brendan can chime in at any time and agree with me or disagree with me. This is a tough read, it's a challenging read, but it is the basis of so much that is part of role-playing games, so much that is part of our understanding of the other worlds, and that is Dante's Divine Comedy. Dante's Inferno, not just Inferno. You can't just read Dante's Inferno. You got to read Purgatory and Paradise as well. It is just an incredible book, and it's a tough read, but there's so much in it that's almost written directly for gamers. The spirits of the dead will be acting a certain way, and you'll say, well, why would they act that way? How would I put it into game terms? And then Dante says, why are they acting that way? And Virgil answers him and tells you how to put it into game terms. It's actually very, very, very elegant. Very clever. That, if you're not reading Dante's Inferno, if you read Dante's Inferno, then you'll understand why you think, why your image of hell is what it is.
Yeah. Actually, you know what, Mike? I just read a bit of it, and I was going to ask you this anyway. Treants, or Ents, they are from Dante's Inferno, aren't they? They are the sinners that are being turned into trees, right?
That's right, yeah.
They are.
Yeah.
Okay, so I thought so.
Yeah.
But yeah, there you go. The people, you have been using these texts as springing off points for ages, and people think of Ents, for example, as these trees, right? But I had my perspective on Ents changed completely when I read that Ents are actually damned spirits that are humans whose toes and fingers and all that stuff have extended out into becoming roots and have and they're in the process of turning into trees. My Ents will from here on out always be way creepier than they ever would have been before, and that's because I read the text.
And some of the imagery that Dante has is just incredible. I mean, the idea of these infernal centaurs running along the banks of a flaming lake, cutting down sinners with arrows from their bows. I mean, it's just over the top kind of stuff, and it's all of that stuff. Go back to the Monster Manual that came out at the same time as that Dungeon Master's Guide, Ben. All those devils and demons, or half of them anyway, they're straight out of Dante's Inferno. So we know Gary was reading source text like that. You know what? Go to the book Ben held up. Go to the Dungeon Master's Guide. Gary Gygax has a one-page list where he lists the sources that he read and he recommends. And you know what? They include the ones we've mentioned. They include all the ones Will mentioned. They include the ones I mentioned. They include the ones Brendan mentioned. It's funny. Gary Gygax, 40 years ago, he mentioned all the source material that we've mentioned. So, read your Harry Potter. That's all great. But if you actually want to understand your Harry Potter, you need to read this other stuff that we're talking about.
Well, Brendan at the very beginning of the show was talking about, cure disease and how you could actually get inspiration from Greek ritual to make it look like genuine, and it would just function like a cure disease in the game, right? And well, that's no surprise that you can do this, because indeed Gary Gygax took reference from a variety of sources he used. Like before he created Dungeons and Dragons, Gary Gygax was creating a ton of games with different people.
Right.
One of them was Alexander the Great, which is a war game where you play one of the battle of Alexander the Great. So he was writing articles about dragons in fantasy wargaming before Dungeons and Dragons was conceived. So that's why some of these spells look like something that comes out straight from antiquity or some mythology or legend. That's because it does. That's why he picked up those ideas and basically mashed them up with the Jack Vance idea of spells that you can put into your mind and release, right? And that's how that shaped up.
Exactly.
Well, gentlemen, I think we had a fantastic discussion tonight on the topic of research, which leaves us only to research our own final thoughts. And I guess my own final thoughts on research: don't let your research become a cage. Don't let it get in the way of whatever you're trying to write, create, or plan. And all of that, just read. Your imagination can come up with wonderful things, but your imagination needs food. You need to feed your brain with all sorts of amazing things before it's and it's going to take that, process it, and start to spin it into all the wonderful fantasies that are going to make things so much better for your players. Oh, Jason?
Also, everything you do, everything you read, everything you watch, wherever you travel, everything you do is research for the next thing.
That's exactly right.
Brendan?
Good way to think of it, Jason.
Well, so I realize that everybody's got a busy life. I've got a busy life. We've all got busy lives, and we end up doing a lot of research and uploading it onto d-infinity.net that you can read and use like it comes off of the shelf at a grocery store. So d-infinity.net is now officially your grocery store for pre-researched ideas coming from the source materials that we have mentioned. So if you're short on time and want something clever, go to that website, put something in the search box, and find something that you can use right away. That's my final thought.
Excellent.
All right, and Ben?
Well, I guess, yeah, my main thought would be stay open to opportunities and try to really be curious. Be curious about everything, and sooner or later you're going to find a completely unexpected idea that's just going to make it into your game. And from there, or reading, say, the Dungeon Master's Guide, you're going to find something that makes you wonder about how plate armor is working, and you're going to go search for it. Like when I was a kid, I used to, my father used to talk to me like I was an adult, and sometimes he would stop his conversation and say, "What does that word mean I just used?" And I would be like, "I don't know. Then why did you agree with it?" And he would tell me, "Go pick a dictionary and find out what that word means, and then you tell me if you agree with me." Well, that's a bit like this, right? You need to be curious about things and try to find out on your own and take your own steps to grasp things around that seems interesting and that can make it into your game, and that's going to make it more interesting.
And Mike, to celebrate your return to the show, once again, you have the final thought.
I would just tell anyone who has not already checked out our Swords of Cost fantasy campaign setting stuff to do so, because we've gone above and beyond for it. We are imaginative people, and we have applied our imaginations to the fantasy campaign setting, and we've also traveled halfway across the frickin' world to research it out. So we've walked the ground that our heroes have walked, so that we could literally, I've stood on the spot where the Colossus of Rhodes' feet have stood. I mean, I've gone to these places and done these things so I could get inside the minds of the ancients and legendary figures and put it into game terms in the most fascinating and interesting and vital way that I could. So check out our Swords of Cost fantasy campaign setting stuff. KOS, or K-Omega, right, Brendan?
Yep.
KOS Coast. Just search against that on DriveThruRPG or any other site, and check out our Coast City, Coast Island, Lands Beyond Coast, Lives of Coast, or Encounters of Coast. And World of Coast is in the works right now.
Excellent. Well, everybody, for myself, William T. Thrasher, for Jason Michael Aarons, for Brendan Cass, for special guest Benoit Poiret, and from Michael Jolly Varhola, this has been D Infinity Live, and we will see you all next week.